All right, so we are going to do a short lecture today, I think. And we're going to start by sharing my screen. All right, so you've got an exam in a week and some change. So please study for that exam. All of the social network content will be on the exam. Everything will be on the exam up until Wednesday of next week. I'll probably ask some light questions from that just the day before the exam, but otherwise, it's all fair game. Please know this, please, and don't be shocked by the high level of rigor that will be required for you to have digested. Okay, so determinism and randomness in social networks. So one of the questions about evolution, about sociality, about any really complex phenomenon that requires a lot of inputs and a lot of context-dependent outcomes is whether or not it's really deterministic, or whether or not everything that we see today is more or less just mostly random. Obviously, there are random, very nearly unpredictable forces that influence much of life. But we hope, as scientists, that there are also a large number of deterministic features: who you are today, what you've become, the friends around you, the path that evolution has taken has deterministic forces that if we just reset it all, if we just redid it, we can ask, would it happen the same way? So if we reset life from the first bacterium that ever existed on the bottom of the ocean, or in muddy, murky pools next to the ocean, or possibly in weird self-replicating crystals, or exactly where you think life began. It turns out there's a lot of fights about this, and we don't really have a great answer because were you there? But that first bacterium, which was not a eukaryote, it did not have a nucleus, if we just went back to that time and reset life, would it happen the same way again? If we reset your life back to when you started school, or back to when you were 3 years old, we can ask, would you develop the same network of friends? Would your best friend have been the same one that you had growing up? Would you have had the same number of friends? Would you have ascended to whatever positions you had in school? Or would you have turned into this recluse that plays video games all day long and procrastinates my class until the last minute? The question is, were your traits, were your circumstances what drove you to where you are now? And it's quite an important question because it really speaks to the matter of free will, whether you have it. And so anyway, let's not get too romantic. So if we could replicate it all again, your social life, the development of human society, if it's highly deterministic, we should see the same things happening over and over again after each reset. The majority of our simulations of the world as we know it would be in parallel, would have most of their features in common. Presumably there'd be some level of disparity between these different replicated resets of the world. There would be some randomness or some very difficult to describe chaos, and we'll eventually get into what the difference is between chaos and true randomness in a later lecture, but right now I'll use them interchangeably. But just basically we want to see, if you reset it all again, would it happen the same way? Would you have the same friend circle if we reset life? Would your grades be the same in my class or in your other classes if we just redid it all again? Would you have the same romantic partner as you have now, or partners, or or the lack thereof? Would you have the same relationship with your siblings? If you're not talking to your sibling right now, if you're ticked off at each other, would you be doing the same thing right now if it were all reset? Would the same people become elected officials? Would Donald Trump, is he an impossible symptom of the social dynamics that were occurring in the US until that moment? Or would we see 50-50 where Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump would have been president of the United States these last 3.5-ish years? We have Margaret Thatcher here on the right-hand side here. She's a famous conservative from the UK. Would she have been elected each time? Would she have been associated with the dismantling of the Cold War? We would have a hard time to know. Presumably, lots of things the sun that day, whether or not somebody got a cold, whether or not their immune system was strong or not, whether or not they met somebody, whether or not they were feeling good that day. Lots of environmental forces that were totally unpredictable or very difficult to predict drove much of what we see now. The notion of like chaos theory, like a butterfly bats its wings in some remote location and that causes some catastrophic event elsewhere. This interconnectedness between lots of very complex features, or organisms, cells, weather, are all interlinked to such a high degree that it renders predictability almost impossible for very complex systems. That's what chaos theory revolves around. Anyway, so was it random or was it deterministic? Would it all happen the same way again? Chaos looks random, but it's not actually random. Chaos actually argues that there are lots of deterministic features that describe a system. It's all deterministic, but it's just so complex that you're not going to be able to really predict it. So it's not predictable, but it's not random. They're deterministic forces, but there's so many of them that it's difficult. And because we have our measurements of any complex system are flawed, even infinitesimally small differences in starting conditions could cause wildly different dynamics to unfurl. And because we can't, even though all of our measurements say, okay, these are the exact same thing, they should go in the exact same way, there are immeasurably small differences in what we think are identical circumstances that cause them to go off on wildly different directions. And so chaos and an inability to really describe the state of a complex system create very low levels of predictability. Anyway, I guess I was going to talk about chaos right now, but I'll talk about chaos again later in the context of figures and things that say these romantic notions that I'm conveying, but provide like real graphical representation. So it's not just abstractions. I'm not just like the guy from Jurassic Park talking about chaos. All right, so let's see. One thing you can do is you can use social networks to basically ask the question, if we redid this all again, would it happen the same way? We can reset social systems that we think are identical over and over and over, or have dissolved and come back together and say, do they reconstitute the features of the total network, or do the individual nodes have the kinds of degree and position and betweenness that they had before? And if it's deterministic, these forces, like do the personality types of all these individuals in these groups assemble together to create the same kind of dynamics over and over and over? If it's deterministic, we should see that it emerges again and again and again in the same way. And if it's mostly chaos or randomness, then we should imagine that those groups that we set up that we think are identical will develop totally different kinds of social network structures. So it's a neat question. It's an obvious question. It's an important question for all of our understanding of comparative social evolution, but nobody knows the answer to this question. And I think it's because no one's really tried to look. So maybe you guys will go and figure this out one day. Anyway, experimental assessments, which would be so clear. You could just set up little worlds of organisms in petri dishes and tubes and in chambers, and you could just figure out whether or not it's deterministic or repeatable. You know, if we have 20 individuals versus 5 individuals, or all aggressive individuals versus docile individuals, or all females versus all males, do we repeatably see these deterministic social networks? And how much of the variation is actually in the social worlds that these organisms live in, estimated by these network statistics? How much of it is shared? How much of it is repeatable? Anyway, so we could ask this question, but no one's done those experiments. You could go do those experiments right now in my lab, Sigal Balschein's lab, Reuven Ducas's lab, and you could begin to chip away at this very important question that people should be asking. Anyway, but there are a small number of natural experiments. Natural experiments means you basically leverage whatever's happening outside to do something that's almost like an experiment, but is not actually an experiment. So you don't actually know what drove your dynamics, observed dynamics. All right, great tits are these tiny little birds that are related to chickadees. I guess they're basically a European chickadee, and they kind of look like a chickadee. Anyway, they're cute little birds here. They're very pretty here. They have a little winter flock eating some sort of like sponge type object. I don't really know what that is. I'm not gonna talk about that anymore. Anyway, so these birds live in winter flocks, but then during the spring, when things warm up, they become ticked off and hate each other, and they develop little breeding territories where males sing and females come, and they pick males based on their songs. But then when it gets to be winter, there's no use in trying to have a baby because they would all freeze to death, and there's no use of maintaining a territory because there's no one's interested in mating because babies would all die, so they become social again. So they have little social lives each and every year, and a great tit probably lives a small number of years. Maybe an old great tit was like 5 or 8 years old. But anyway, they live multiple years. So the cool thing about this is that every year these animals go through an episodic period where they're not interacting with each other in any sort of friendly capacity. And then each winter, they form these flocks over and over and over with the same individuals. So you could ask whether or not these same individuals redevelop the same kind of social network statistics each and every year when these seasonal wintering flocks reemerge. And oh, gee, what do you know? Do individual birds assume similar network positions between seasons when relationships reform? The answer is yes. So if you are highly social, highly connected, you're an important confluence between cliques of these birds, you tend to have these positions again and again and again. Hooray! So you could say that there's something about these individual birds, about their traits or their sex or their size or their condition, but there's something semi-stable about them, endogenous to who these little birds are as individuals, that make them occupy these social roles. It's not all chaos. It's highly deterministic. But there are some problems with a study like this, right? So what can you really conclude? Are these, one critique that's listed on this slide that I think is worth noting is whether or not these are any real resets, right? So like, the birds knew each other. I mean, I don't know how much, it's hard to know how much a tiny little chickadee thing in Europe actually knows, right? Like, they don't self-report. So like, do these birds remember each other from last year? Do they have little rivalries and like little bird friends that they knew from years past? Or, like, if they do, then it's not really a reset, right? They just went off and like got bird married for a season and came back together after they had little bird divorces, and now they're all back to their social lives, and that they started back where they left off. You don't really know, because it's hard to know what they remember. So is it a real reset? Hard to say. Are there carryover effects from previous years? Is there hysteresis carryover effects? Probably. But we don't know. People should really do real experiments on this. You can do real experiments on this. You could go get fruit flies right now. People are throwing them away in the biology department, and you could go set up these own little replicated worlds over and over and over and let them run for multiple generations and see the degree of determinism that happens if you could redo it all again. One of the most important questions in evolutionary biology and our understanding of life. And instead, people just ignore it or haven't thought of it, or I don't know. You should go do it. I'll help you. I'll give you whatever resources I can. If you're interested, just go do it. God, we really should know the answer to this question. Some people do answer these questions with bacteria for experimental evolution, but behavioral ecology has not spent much time investigating this topic. It is a wide open field, and it's likely to be very impactful if you study questions like this. You'll become famous. All right. Static versus dynamic social networks. Static social networks are, you take a bunch of information about a network, you combine it all together, and you make one big network. That's the network. A dynamic social network acknowledges that through time, the network structure is going to change, and the attributes about the nodes in the network are also going to change. So the edges will emerge and vanish, they'll change in thickness and shrink, and new nodes will show up to groups. New individuals show up, and other nodes will perish or emigrate away, right? So dynamic social networks have more information in them, but they require more information to create them, right? So you can't just like watch them for some amount of time and create a network. You have to try to figure out like, okay, am I going to make a new social network for each year that I watch these hyena? Or should I make a network for every day that these flies are alive for because they're only going to live a small number of days? Or how much time should I put together to create one sub-network? And then I'll do that over and over and over. And then I can tell a computer, okay, at each of these discrete time points, that I've determined a priori are time points that make sense for the questions that I'm addressing and the temporal scales that make sense for the system, hyenas versus flies. What's going on here in the network? What additional information can I glean? And a computer is good at doing this. So on the right-hand side here, these little pink, I'm sorry for the gender normative coloration of pink female baboons. You should know that one of my favorite colors is pink, and so whatever. Like, please don't be offended by this. Anyway, let's look at this clique of female baboons on the right-hand side here that are this beautiful shade of pink. All right, these edges are white. Those are social connections between those nodes. The nodes are females. They're all together. The edges are grooming, we'll say, in this relationship here. So we have thick lines between this medium-sized circle and this big-sized circle, suggesting that she's getting lots of grooms, or lots of grooming is occurring between these two individuals. This is not a directed social network, so whatever. But then we have examples where there's like little thin relationships here. Anyway, visually appealing, this little constellation of female baboons. All right, so you could say here that more connected, the size of the nodes here represent reproductive output. So this big, fat, juicy looking female down here, she's actually really, really fertile, or she's really a good mom or whatever. So you can see here that these small circles tend to have relatively weak connections. Their connections are fewer and they're thinner. These intermediate sized circles here have thicker connections on average, and this big honkin' Myrtle the Fertile Turtle female baboon has oodles of connections and they're thick. Good for her. So that's great. You know that there's an association, a correlation between the frequency and intensity of grooming and whether or not these females are more or less reproductive. So what can you conclude? Well, you could conclude that individuals that are high quality get groomed a lot. You want to have good social relationships with the virile, I guess fertile in this case, fertile and high performing females in your social group. Makes sense. You're gonna like ride on their coattails or something, right? Sure, groom them, they're going places. Anyway, or alternatively, you could ask, does a high frequency of grooming actually cause greater fitness? Maybe being groomed all the time means that you have fewer lice or sanguivorous insects living on you that could give you diseases, right? So maybe being groomed helps you become more reproductive, helps you survive better. You have no way of telling those two hypotheses apart using this static social network on the side. Bad news bears for you. You can't tell them apart, and those hypotheses both make pretty good sense. You could probably, in your armchair, say, no, I prefer hypothesis A over hypothesis B for the following reasons that were observed in capuchin monkeys. But it would just be a bunch of arm waving. But static social networks aren't the only option. We can have dynamic social networks. Now we're looking at a dynamic social network, right? So now on the left-hand side here, we have these large females and these small females, and we see these relatively small, thin connections. Then we see at the second time point, which might be a year later, let's imagine that we only can spend 4 weeks in Kenya watching these baboons, and then we have to go home to our real lives and stuff, pretending to be Jane Goodall and pay our bills and stuff. Anyway, so we go for 3 years, and we see that in the first year, there are reproductive females that are really fertile, and there are less females that are less fertile. And then in year 2, we see that, this social group, the dynamics are changing, and that some of these thicknesses are getting larger, and the connections are becoming more robust. And then at time point 3, we see that there are really, really thick connections now. What did you get from this dynamic network that you didn't get in your social network that was static in the previous slide? Well, you see here that differences in fitness occurred before the grooming connections, right? So at time point 1, 3 years ago, there were already Myrtle the Fertile Turtle and like gone not reproductive females in existence, right? And there were very few differences, or if there were any differences at all, in their interconnectedness in these grooming networks. But through time, we see that these fertile females, especially fertile female, received a larger and larger number of grooming interactions, which show us that, or hint, that the fertility differences, these state differences in female qualities, were the precursor to these grooming relationships, which would hint that the status was driving the increases in grooming behavior and not vice versa. Now we're looking at the exact opposite trend. So now we're seeing that, yeah, there are big hulking females here, and there are teeny tiny little emaciated females that are just not producing any offspring at all, barely even releasing unfertilized eggs. And in the first year, we see these differences, and then we see that the connections become greater for some individuals, and that we see different changes through time in association with these additional connections. We see a proliferation of new connections at the second time point to this bottom right-hand individual who has become coincident with them, more fertile. And then we see another time step in the future where the interconnectedness is more or less the same, but now we see that that female in the bottom right-hand corner is really, really fertile and really, really successful at rearing offspring. So we're seeing here that the high level of connections are the precursor or precipitating, apparently, the increases in reproductive output. Because they occur first, they appear to be triggering the thing that occurs subsequently. That's the assumption of these dynamic social networks. What's occurring first is triggering what comes later. And so because differences in grooming bonds herald, i.e. are the precursors to these increases in reproductive output, we think that they're more likely to be the driver. So you can use these temporal slices to be able to differentiate between these two different alternatives. Make sense? Cool. All right, but it's a chicken and egg type scenario. So basically you say, okay, so if one thing occurs before the other, then I guess that's the driver. And you're gonna infer causality. But really, you don't really know, right? So maybe the female in the bottom right-hand corner, suddenly her social group experienced a coup, or there was a death and some rival that was not noticed in this network that actually caused her to have an increase in social bonds and an increase in her reproductive output that have nothing to do with either the grooming bonds or starting differences in quality that drove those associations. So even those temporal slices can have other features you're not measuring that are driving those dynamics, that they're actually, you do not know what caused them. You're trying to infer what the likely cause is based on this order of operations in the social network through time. By the way, the chicken and egg hypothesis, or the chicken and egg conundrum is although like poetically interesting, the egg is the precursor to the chicken because reptiles have eggs, right? And like females have eggs. Anyway, whatever. Okay, how dynamic is dynamic? So if you're going on every year and you watch them for 4 weeks, is that really that dynamic? I mean, you're not like watching the moment-to-moment shifts in the social network. You're just sort of like making multiple static networks and then binning them artificially and then comparing how these individuals are changing their relationships and in their states through time, which, as I said before, how you bin them over what duration is really important to the kinds of questions you have at hand. Short-lived organisms that you think are changing their social lives regularly, you're going to bin them on much shorter scales. And for organisms that you think have stable relationships that are changing over relatively long time scales, then you can bin things across years. Truly dynamic social networks that account for the moment-to-moment interactions, those are very, very rare. And we don't even have the computational methods yet worked out of how to analyze them. So imagine something like this, that we have a huge number of slices here, and 6 isn't even that many, but 6 would be a lot for what we've ever done with animals before, any sort of analysis. With this level of slicing, you can see that we have, in most of these networks, we're not really observing all that many interactions, but the fact that we could slice things up from moment to moment to moment to account for all of those interactions at a very fine scale, one day we'll be able to account for all those very nuanced moment-to-moment interactions with rigorous statistics and visual approaches. But we haven't worked them out yet. Really, really dynamic social networks that have lots and lots and lots of time point sampling and many sub-networks. They capture high-resolution dynamics, but each individual network itself will have less information in it. So across all of the little sub-networks, you'll have more information, but in each tiny sliced temporal scale sub-network, these are all sub-networks, T1 through T6 on the x-axis here, you're gonna have less information. But when you concatenate that information, when you combine it with all those other slices, you're gonna get a more refined sense of the system. And we still haven't even used anything like this. You could go do something like this right now, probably in your dorm room, and enhance our understanding of social evolution and social dynamics really powerfully. We know so little. It's really shocking. So in this social network, I'm simulating the same conclusion from hypothesis 2, that bonds beget fitness, but I've played it out over many, many slices, and it's harder for your eye to notice it, but it is noticeable. I basically just decomposed those 3 time point slides, and then I made them at a finer scale to show that this is the same hypothesis as H2 playing out over 6 time points. So that's 25 minutes. That's actually how long I'm supposed to make all of these lectures. That's what's encouraged by the university, but we would never get anywhere. So tomorrow, we'll go over multi-layer networks and multi-level selection in social networks. So we'll be able to complete social networks and go into, I think next week is dominance hierarchies, or it's aggression. I think it's aggression first and then dominance hierarchies. Yeah, no, dominance hierarchies are next week. Anyway, so yeah, I'll see you guys tomorrow, and hopefully I'll get to interact with some of you on Friday. Please do come visit me. Your exam's coming up, and so I assume my office hours will be more popular tomorrow. So please, please, please be watching these videos. Please don't watch them all at the last minute. And hopefully I'll talk to you soon. And hopefully the sound has been working this whole time. We'll see.